All right, so we've been talking about CSS grids, and we got to the sort of the basics in the last one where we could set up the number of columns we would have and how many columns and what the width of those columns would be. We could also set up the height of our rows. Let's talk about, sometimes we may want to put gaps in between our rows and heights, our columns. So for instance, let's say here, I have these two columns, and I want there to be a little bit of a gap here. What I could do I could set something like this, where there's like this little gap between my columns, So we can, and I can also do that for rows too, where if I was going to insert I can set up this gap here, right? So what I'm going to do is we're going to build something that looks like this. Okay, it's a 2-column layout, and we also have some column gap, which is the space between your columns. Use a different color. And I also have a row gap, which goes between the rows. Okay, so let's first set this up as just a 2-column layout. So, I'm not going to go through everything again, but essentially it's like the other ones where I have this container. It has a bunch of sections in it. Each one's about dogs, or breeds of dogs. And I'm going to take this container and let's turn it into a grid. So display grid. Let's make it a 2-column layout, grid, template, columns. I'm going to set it to being a percentage. So let's just set it to 2-column layout, 50%, 50%. And let's preview that. All right, there's my 2-column layout. If I want to put space between my columns, that is referred to as column gap. So if I say column gap 50 pixels, well, it's going to put 50 pixels between my gap, or between my columns here. If I want to have space between my rows, well, that would be row gap. Okay. You can also use the shorthand of grid gap. Is it grid gap? I want to say it is. Yeah, it is grid gap. And I believe with grid gap, you can give it 2 values. The first value, I believe, is the row gap, and the second value is the column gap. So if I do 100 pixels, 25 pixels, yeah, the first value is the row gap. So, this is just a shorthand if you want to do it that way, or you can have it as 2 separate lines. Either way is fine. Okay. Note that when you're doing column gap, it's between any column you have. So if I break this into, say, 4 columns, by doing this, I'm still always going to get the same amount of space between my columns. Okay. All right. Next thing I'm going to show you guys is what's referred to as a fraction. This is something you're going to see, especially if you look at, like, if you're going to watch videos online or find some tutorials, you're going to find this, what's called a fraction, used a lot. Now, a fraction is a measurement that's only really used for CSS grids, okay? But I want to show what it looks like. So once again, let's kind of show what it's going to look like. All right, so this is what we're building. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and once again, these are baseball teams. Each baseball team is in a section. They're all inside of this container. I'm going to say container. And I'm going to break this into a 3-column layout. So let's do display grid. grid template columns. 33%, 33%, 33%. Let's preview that. Oops, that's an old page. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do, so this is 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. One thing you have to understand is when you use columns, there's also the total width of your item, and the total width is your columns plus any gap. Okay, so what I mean by that is this is currently taking up 100% of the width because each one is 33%, or I guess if you wanted to be more closer to 100%, it would be this 33.33, 33, right? That should get closer. So this should be roughly close to 100%, right? Now, if I come in here and I add a column gap, like say 100 pixels, well, what's happening here is that 100 pixels is moving this over, and then 100 pixels is moving this over. So what's actually happening is whatever the width of my page is, let's just hypothetically say it's 1,000 from here to here. Well, now that's 1,000 plus the 100 plus 100. So now my whole content is is larger or longer than the size of my page. And you can see that some of my text is going off the side here, right? Now, you could try to fix this by just using a smaller percentage. You could say, well, okay, let's use 31 instead of 33 and hope that it all kind of evens out. I'm still not quite getting it, right? And I could keep doing this for hours and hours, and I don't really want to, but you could try to do that. But there's another way to do this, okay? Now, it's like I said, it's something called a fraction. And a fraction is a measurement for columns that includes gaps, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come inside here, and I'm going to say 1 FR, or 1 fraction, 1 FR, 1 FR, okay? Now, what this essentially does is your browser will figure out how many fractions you built, and it will divide it evenly. So in other words, like, since there's 1, 2, 3, and in theory, each one is worth the same amount, it goes, oh, well, okay, if this is 100% and there's 1, 2, 3, then I have to divide this into thirds, 33.3%, right? If I'm going to save, so you can see that this divides it. Now, if I did something like this, what this is saying is, well, whatever this is twice the amount of these two. So now what I've done is I've actually said that this is going to be about 50%, and these are going to be 25%. So on and so on. I'm not, you could keep doing this, and I could make this 3FR, which means whatever value this is has to be 3 times the amount of these other two, and it would keep doing out the math. Now, in this case, I just want them to be each a third. I don't need one to be bigger than the other, okay? Now, the problem is that before, when you had them as percentages, if you added gap, it would push, it would add it to the total, and it would actually make it more than 100%. Well, in this case, when you use a fraction, the fraction includes any gap. So even if I apply a gap like this, notice that my content does not go off the side of the page, okay? So typically when people set up columns, they like to use fractions instead of using percentages, just because it allows you to add gaps if you need to add gaps later. The other thing I want to show you guys is, let's say I wanted to have 6 columns, right? So I could do something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But eventually it becomes a little bit harder to read. There's a shorthand that you're going to probably see a lot of people use. And this is, once again, this is a specific to columns, CSS columns thing. It's called a repeat, okay? And repeat does what it sounds like. It repeats something. What we're repeating is how many columns we want and how big is each column. So if I say 6 1FR, what I'm saying here is I want there to be 6 columns. Each column is going to have a width of 1FR. Or it could be, it doesn't have to be a fraction. It could be 100 pixels or 10% or whatever it is that I want. Okay. So if I said, let's just make this 200, 100 pixels, well, I'm going to have 6 columns, each that's 100 pixels wide, like that. Okay. But in this case, I want them to be 1 fraction unit, or 1/6 of a page, which whatever 100 divided by 6 is, 16.6, 2/3%. Okay. So this is just, this number here is always the number of columns. Sorry, my spelling, it's hard to draw this number of columns. This is always going to be, the second value is always going to be the measurement, or how wide each column is going to be. All right. So in this case, I would probably want it like this, where there's going to be 3 columns. Each one is 1 fraction. So it's going to be divided into thirds. And this thirds allows you to add column gap if you want to, like that. Okay. All right. Let's talk about, I'm going to go back to my little analogy here, right? Now, let's say for the sake of argument, I wanted to have a piece of text. I'm going to get rid of this column here. Let's say I wanted a piece of text that would sit in the horizontal center here. So I wanted to kind of sit here. Oops, I thought I was drawing. I want it to sit like there, right? Now, the problem here is that, well, it can't sit here in the middle because of this, the way the columns are set up. I could align this to the right, or I could align this to the left, but it's never going to sit exactly halfway through, because items in the grid can't sit on top of the grid. Okay. Now, what I could do is, well, what if we took these 2 table cells, and what if we merge them together like this? Okay, see how I merged them into 1 table cell? And now that this is considered 1 cell, well, I could align this to the center, right? And see how it kind of sits over that line? Well, that's kind of what we're going to do. Okay, I'm going to show you something. So I have this layout here, and notice that it's kind of a 3-column layout, 1, 2, 3, but the Stephen King section is actually kind of 2/3 of the page. Well, this is 1/3. But just for this one line, I don't want every column to be like this, just this one column. And this J.K. Rowling is going over 2 rows. Okay. So once again, just to kind of show you what's going on here, I have this container. I'm going to add a little class of container to it. Inside are each one of the authors. And so let's set this up into a 3-column layout really quickly. So I'm going to say container display grid, and let's do grid template columns. Let's set it to be 3 columns. Okay, so let's just do repeat 3, 1 fraction. If this is too hard, you could just also set it to percentages. If fractions still being weird to you, just make it, 33, 33, 33. That's fine. All right, there's my 3-column layout. All right, so what I want this to do is I want this to extend from here to there. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back into inspect mode. I'm going to click on this, and I'm just going to change the color. I'm trying to find something that works well here. All right, so the way it works is that you see these little lines here. There's a line here and a line here and a line here and a line here. These are called column numbers. And so there's a column to the left of your tape of your grid. And then there's basically a column in between each table cell, and there's one at the end. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to make the Stephen King go from column 1. Now, by default, it goes to column 2, right? You go one column at a time. But essentially what I'm going to do is I want it to span or expand from here to column 3. What that'll do is it'll take everything else and just kind of push it to the right, and it'll move everything down. So how would I do that? Well, instead of applying it to the entire grid, I have to apply it to that particular table cell. This is this particular table cell. So what I'm going to do is here in my HTML, I actually gave that particular table cell an ID that's specific to that element. Okay, so let's use that. It's called King. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say grid column start. Grid column start means where is the column line that we're starting at? Well, I'm starting here on line 1. So let's do line 1. And then I have to tell it where it's going to end, or grid column end. Now, normally it ends at column line 2, but I actually want it to end here at column line 3. So if I type in 3 here and I save and let's refresh, see how this now expands, and see how this goes from line 1 to line 3. If I wanted it to go all the way across, that would be going from line 1 to line 4. Okay. But in this case, I just wanted to go to line 1, or sorry, line 3. All right, going back once again to Microsoft Excel or whatever it is, it's like I can take, not only can I take two table cells that are next to each other in a row, I can also take 2 table cells on top of each other in a column, and I could merge them together. Okay, that would be called a row span. I could do the same thing here. So what I actually want to do is I want this J.K. Rowling to move from here downward. Okay, so that it kind of moves into here. Once again, I'm going to put this in inspect, and I'm going to click on this grid, and I'm going to change the color so hopefully it's a little bit easier to see. Now, remember how we talked about column numbers? Well, there's also row numbers. And so here, this number here is my row. So this is row 1, row 2, row 3, and then at the very end should be row 4. Okay, so there's one at the top of your grid before the grid starts. There's one in between each row, and then there's one at the end. Okay. So once again, what we're trying to do is I want to, typically you go from row to row. So normally it's like, it goes from row line 1 to row line 2, row line 2 to row line 3. But I want this to expand more than 1. So what I'm going to do here is J.K. Rowling has her own little ID here. There it is. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to select that particular section, and we're going to say, instead of a grid column start, we're going to say row column, or sorry, grid row start. So where am I starting at? Well, I'm starting at row 2, because this is where I'm starting at, or row number 2. And then we have to say where are we ending? Well, we are ending at row 4. Okay. So let's refresh this. Okay. So this is my column span, and this is my row span. All right. So why don't you give that a try out? In the next one, we'll go over how to use the row and column to really make some complex layouts. And we'll also talk about using grid to quickly center or align multiple items.